Okay, so my name is Julie Reeder, and I'm with Reader Media and Village News and Valley News. And we're welcoming Jack Dake today, who is an expert in oil and gas exploration and has been in the oil and gas exploration industry for how long, Jack?
42 years.
42 years. So he knows what he's talking about. So the first thing that we wanted to do is have you give a short bio, just so people understand that you do know what you're talking about.
Well, like I say, I've been in the industry 42 years, and my background is in the legal, government regulation, oil and gas land, which has to do with determining who owns the minerals and addressing all the legal issues that involve that, contracts negotiation. And one of my areas of expertise, which is a little bit unusual in the industry, has been with government regulation and dealing with all kinds of regulatory bodies. And from that, you have to be prepared for not only knowledgeable of the regulations, but you have to have a pretty broad knowledge, at least an exposure to all facets of oil and gas exploration, from being able to start where somebody wants to drill and why they want to drill there, to finding out who owns there and who owns oil and gas rights underneath, and then find all of the people involved and make contracts with them. And then once that is done, then you move to the regulatory side. And the regulatory side can take years. You know, it's a very, even on private properties, it can take years. And sometimes it takes court action. Sometimes you run into hostile people in the governmental bodies that try to obstruct the rights of the mineral owners and the people who want to have their properties developed. Once that is done, then the iron moves on and the wells is drilled. And hopefully you found something that's economically viable to produce. And at that point, then it goes back to preparing the well physically for production, but it also then moves back into the regulatory land legal stage, because now all the things that have to be done post-drilling to make sure all the owners get paid, and it's the right owners, and they're properly paid, and that all the regulatory aspects are complied with. The oil and gas industry is pretty much everyone who's ever looked or argued or discussed from whatever viewpoint of oil and gas. It is the most regulated industry in the United States. It's highly regulated on every level. Cities regulate it, counties regulate it, states regulate it, and the federal government from multiple cabinet agencies regulate it. So that involves a lot of things. Not very many people have an exposure to all of those areas. Most, particularly in bigger companies, people are pretty narrowly focused on one area of oil and gas. So I've been fortunate in my career to be with companies that have needed and allowed me to cover the entire spectrum, from where do we want to drill to how do we get people paid and how do we keep this well in compliance with our regulations. And that includes insurance things too, by the way.
Sure. So there have been some current events that have taken place, and the differences, as you know, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration as it pertains to the oil and gas industry and all that is quite different. And Trump had the goal of America being completely independent and not dependent on Russia or the Middle East or Venezuela, other countries for our oil and gas. And so one of the first things that Biden did was cancel the Keystone Pipeline project. So what do you know about that? It doesn't seem like it was an environmentally sound decision, because driving trucks over land is far less environmentally sound than a pipeline, as I understand it. And that means that we're also going to be importing oil and gas from other countries where their refining of the product is not as clean as ours. Is that correct?
Oh, all of that's correct, and even more. Uh, it's just a ridiculous decision that is made in defiance of science, in defiance of obvious economics, in defiance of national security. It's in defiance of American energy independence, and it's designed for the sole purpose of creating higher oil and gas prices, which it will. Now, oil and gas mean oil and gasoline prices. It will also have the corresponding effect of creating higher natural gas prices. All of those things affect the poor first and hardest. It affects everyone, even in hospitals and schools, paying higher energy bills for schools. That affects taxpayers. It affects the public school systems, and it affects police departments tremendously. It affects the airline industry tremendously. Can you remember how airlines were putting on surcharges on air tickets because of the high prices?
For fuel.
Right. The common sense policies that all of us in America who are not rabidly environmentalists, but who are rabidly rationalist and who act off science, knew that America could be energy independent. And finally, we got someone in the White House whose name was Donald Trump, who did what we wanted. He actually did what he said he would do when he told us that he would do it. And boy, a lot of people didn't like it. But to discuss the Keystone Pipeline itself, since that's kind of the focal point here, pretty much everyone starts with the discussion of jobs. I mean, that's first, he canceled 11,000 jobs immediately.
Mm-hmm.
As important as that is, and that's obviously extremely important to do that to our economy, to do that so brutally and viciously and cold-heartedly as he did, first day in office, without the slightest regard to these people at all and what it did to them. Jobs is really about 4 or 5 on the importance of what he did wrong.
Really?
Yeah, jobs, as bad as that is, and it's important, but it's really down the list of bad that went along with that decision. But let's start there, because that's where everyone starts. 11,000 or more jobs were that were part of building the line itself were killed. 8,000 roughly of those jobs were actual union jobs. Yeah, what did the union leaders instruct their members to do when they had Donald Trump building the line and giving them all these jobs, and the Democrat who promised to kill the pipeline? The union leaders screwed their own union members, 8,000 of them. And the Perryman Group, which is a group, you can look them up, their analysis is that about 200,000 or more jobs are actually affected when you take the ripple effect, when you stop the construction. You know, you got people that make pipe, people that truck the pipe, people that supply the parts and material that go into laying the pipe, sealing the pipe, and all of that. Factories all across America are affected because they were supplying billions of dollars in material to the pipeline. They will be hurt also by this decision. They're not often discussed. It's normally just the people physically working on the line that are discussed. But this decision ripples out across America. Now, when you kind of wonder, it's just kind of interesting to look at this decision. Canceling the XL pipeline, or Keystone Pipeline is more commonly called. And by the way, we should make the point here, the Keystone Pipeline is actually in 4 parts. The first 3 parts have been essentially done and are essentially operating. This was the 4th part. It was a critical part, but it was the 4th part of the line. And now it's stopped with, I don't know how much percentage, I haven't actually seen that number, of it's already laid in the ground. Yeah. I mean, you talk about economic waste, but again, who competes with the pipeline? I I mean, why would someone not want the pipeline there? Well,
Wow.
trucking industry gets to move the line if it doesn't go through pipelines. And the train industry. Well, guess who owns a lot of the rail service that would move this oil?
Who?
One of the biggest contributors to the Democrat Party, Warren Buffett.
Really?
Oh, that's correct. And so that group of people, particularly Warren Buffett, but others, not just him, benefit majorly by canceling the XL line. And so you can't deny that this decision had much as its basis was political only, in defiance of science. That Biden likes to say, as all the Democrats do, we're going to listen to the science.
Mm-hmm.
And just like when they accuse you of something, that's what they're doing. When they tell you to listen to the science, you know exactly for a moment that's not what they're going to do. They're going to act politically. Everyone who even studies this, anything at all, everyone, even the environmental, know that pipelines are the safest way to transport products that can be moved by pipeline. They pose the smallest environmental risk, way smaller than rail, way smaller than trucking, and certainly of air. The University of Alberta found there's a 61 to 77% reduction in emissions when pipelines are used over trucking. Now, if you're an environmentalist and you think that the XL pipeline or Keystone Pipeline is a bad thing, then why would you want to have much greater emissions by moving the oil without the pipeline? That makes no sense at all, not environmentally. It only is done it for political purposes. Also, if you're an environmentalist, the Keystone Pipeline is designed to be operated totally by renewable energy, green energy, by the year 2030. There's no way that rail service and trucking service can be renewable energy. It can't be done. There's the laws of physics. You can't have that kind of power to move things in anything other than in hydrocarbons. You know, the science, the economics, the science of economics, we could say, the safety, environmental safety, or we could say environmental science. You talk about national security, you know, which we'll visit more here in a minute. The societal benefits, particularly by keeping energy prices low, affects the poorest among us the most. Mm-hmm. It's like raising the cost of food. Right. Well, that's adverse to everybody, but who does it affect the most? The poorest among us. And killing the Keystone Pipeline is going to affect mostly the poor people.
Well, what about the tribes too that were going to benefit from it?
Yes, in fact, one of the numbers is, I mean, it's a public number, is about $800 million was going to be received by the tribes just in the construction of the line and some other aspects of that. And then there's the local and state situations where taxes and fees and all kinds of benefits to the economies in those states, but certainly just in taxes alone, property taxes and other kind of taxes, we're all going to benefit. All of those are being killed. South Dakota today is pointing out their economy is almost, it's staggered their economy by shutting this down.
So
that also is a political point.
That's what I was gonna say. Do you think that had anything to do with it? South Dakota is very red.
Oh, look at where this is at. It's totally the red states. Everything will be done in the next months in the Biden administration to cripple the red states as much as possible, because you don't want this contrast between the blue states and the red states that we have now. And so again, this decision was not made for environmental purposes. It wasn't made for rational purposes unless you consider political power and manipulation rational.
So
but it wasn't for science.
Where are we likely to get our oil and gas now that that pipeline has been shut down?
Okay, that pipeline, just remember, it's just the part 4 at this point that's been killed. That doesn't mean they might not try to stop the rest of it. But by killing that fourth part, it increases, it totally destroys, or not destroys, it makes highly likely that we will not be energy independent. And then secondly, we will have to acquire foreign energy, oil, gasoline. A lot of people don't know. They think we just simply buy oil from foreign countries. We actually buy fully processed oil and gas, which is gasoline. And those gasoline, gallons of gasoline that we buy are refined and produced in foreign countries that have very lax environmental laws, nothing like what we have here in America. Those refineries pollute far worse. In China, for example, is just horrible polluter, the worst on the planet. No one seems in this group, though, to be asking China to make any changes. In fact, they want to make it more likely we buy products from China, including stuff made by petroleum that is produced in these dirty refineries. But clearly, Democrats do not want Americans to be energy independent. They don't want us to have $2.50 gas, or $200, we had $2 gas here in Oklahoma under the Trump administration. And Biden's decision is a gift to the Russian, according to every Russian expert. The party that benefits the most of this is actually not the Middle East, it's Russia. And it's James Clapper's pointed out to everybody repetitively, if there's anything Putin knows how to do, it's how to handle an asset. The very first day Joe Biden's elected, he couldn't have done anything more to make Vladimir Putin ecstatic than what he did with the Keystone Pipeline. Clapper's exactly right. He's got his guy, Putin's got his guy in there. It wasn't Trump, it was the Democrats. Okay, and now America will have to import more oil and gasoline from other countries. That's going to happen. We saw this already in Germany. We know exactly what's going to happen. Germany's dependence on foreign oil and foreign products from oil increased dramatically when they shut down their nuclear industry. So all they did was take a clean industry. Nuclear is one of the cleanest industries out there. It's one of the most cost-effective and environmentally beneficial ways to produce electricity.
And why did they shut down the nuclear plants?
Because the environmentalists don't like nuclear stuff.
Okay.
They don't like it. And yet, when you look at nuclear, it's absolutely one of the superior ways. It's actually a superior way over natural gas. Now, I'm in the oil and gas exploration industry. I'd like to see all electricity produced by natural gas as cleanest way to produce it in the world. And, second only to nuclear as far as producing it in quantity. I mean, hydro is the cheapest, cleanest way, but there's not enough places left for dams to do that. So you're to nuclear, and you're to natural gas is the best way. So, it would be better for the United States to receive oil from Canada, not from Russia or Saudi Arabia, or receive oil from places that simply Russia and Saudi Arabia displace that oil and we buy it. It doesn't matter if we're buying it directly from Saudi Arabia or Russia. As long as we have to import oil, it's their oil that is displacing wherever the oil comes from that eventually winds up in America. So essentially it is us buying it. And if I explain that where it makes sense. In other words,
I think so.
Essentially where that oil comes from, it's those two. Now, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada is well recognized as a true believer in environmentalism. He's a true believer in global warming. Mm-hmm. He was deeply disappointed with Biden's decision. He was, in fact, the foreign minister to the United States was aghast. He's taken aback that the Biden administration didn't even discuss this with them before they did it, because this pipeline would have moved Canadian oil as well as American oil, but it would have moved Canadian oil, and it really screwed Canada also. And so,
and they had already spent like billions of dollars
billions. That's right.
on
It's
the
along with
project.
American.
So
That's American
aren't
company.
we, I thought I had heard that they were going to be looking to be compensated for that.
Oh, there's going to be lawsuits following
Yeah.
that. There's going to be attorneys working on it. But the point about Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada is this, though. As a true believer in the religion of global warming, Prime Minister Trudeau would have never allowed this pipeline if there was any basis whatsoever that it would be environmentally disadvantaged.
Sure.
It's not. He knows that this is a beneficial thing for the environment. And even the New York Times in 2014 did an article back on the Keystone Pipeline. As you know, during the Obama administration, they were trying to kill it all the time. But even their article points out that the Keystone Pipeline would have a marginal impact on global warming emissions. It'd have a marginal impact. That is building the pipeline. Okay.
Right.
Another expert in that article quoted, the decision on Keystone is irrelevant or insignificant. It's a drop in the bucket when it comes to global warming and the religion of of the environment. It has nothing to do with adverse effects on the climate. As far as building the line, not having the line did.
Right.
Did you know that 5 separate times the Obama State Department found that the pipeline would have no material impact on greenhouse gas emissions?
No.
5 separate times, and yet Obama killed it. Okay, or he did. In fact, the Obama administration found that shipping oil and gas by rail or tanker, trucks, would result in 28 to 42% higher CO2 emissions and more leaks than by doing it in a pipeline. So, I mean, this whole decision about the Keystone Pipeline defies science. It defies every societal norm for trying to benefit society, particularly the poorest among us. It defies national security. It defies economics on a grand scale. It's unjust is what it's done to the people that's made the investments there. There are Indian tribes that will receive or have already received part of $800 million from the construction and operation of this line. Some of that's out the window now.
Right.
And we've already mentioned the state and county and local governments that the pipeline goes through. There's school districts get those tax dollars. All of these people are adversely affected by this insane decision. It is a delusion to suggest that stopping the Keystone Pipeline had anything to do with the environment. That is an advantageous move to the environment. It's delusional to suggest that.
Now, you already mentioned Warren Buffett possibly receiving a benefit because of the railway, and Russia because we would likely buy our oil and gas from them. What about the wind and solar industries?
Okay, well, let's make sure we'll address that just in a moment. The buying the oil and gas from foreign countries, it's likely we will be buying more from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, okay.
Remember, now, we probably wouldn't be buying directly from Russia. We would be buying oil from other people who were not selling to us, who now will, and the people they were selling to will now buy their oil from Russia. So it's called an offset, really. But, it's still us causing it. We're still the ones getting the oil from Russia because all it does is it goes from Russia to the people that were buying it because we're now buying what they were buying. If we had not done this, then that oil would still be going there. Russia still wouldn't be benefiting from it. Putin would not be happy, and Joe Biden would be feeling the heat from Putin. So this way he keeps Putin very happy. And it's just interesting. If Clapper could call Trump a Russian asset without any basis, and Trump is, curtailing Russia at every point, then here's the guy helping Russia. It's pretty clear to see who's a Russian asset, according to James Clapper. So, and then the other point was here about wind. Well, we've spent, who knows, it may be $1 trillion, maybe $1.5 trillion on wind energy. It's hard to put numbers to it.
Well, and you've experienced the benefits of wind and solar energy just the last couple of days, right?
Oh, it's awful. Everyone from North Dakota to Mexico
Texas.
has experienced this, the disastrous results of wind energy. I mean, you could actually generate electricity cheaper by getting teenagers and putting them on bicycles, stationary bicycles with generators, and let them pedal. Then you can generate it cost effectively with wind. To this hour, no one really knows a more costly way to generate electricity than with wind.
Is that right?
It's about, last numbers I've seen were about 35 cents a kilowatt hour to generate the electricity. Now that doesn't even count the transmission lines, because you had to build new transmission lines to do all this, and those cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were totally unneeded. You could have used existing transmission lines and improved them if the money had been spent on clean coal and on natural gas generation. That's what it should have been spent on. And then you would have the supply you need. But even with wind, as we see, many things go wrong with wind energy. And this last weather blast is just one of recent ones. The blades on the wind turbines freeze over. They get too heavy. They won't spin. And then the material and mechanisms inside the tops of the wind generators malfunction and get destroyed. And it was interesting because, as many people have seen recently here in the last 2 days, took helicopters up because they needed the electricity from the wind generators that don't function. And they took helicopters burning hydrocarbons, burning gasoline and jet fuel, carrying big old containers of hydrocarbons, de-icers made from oil, and then they're spraying them on the wind generators made from oil products and with oil products to produce wind energy. I mean, it's the most insane thing in the world. It's a scam.
But what happened was when they froze over, you and thousands or millions of people were without power.
Millions. In fact, 4 million or so in Texas, because Texas went into wind energy even bigger than Oklahoma.
And I think I read that it's been 3 days. Some people have been without power for 3 days in freezing weather.
Oh, it's awful. Here we had rolling blackouts that lasted 1 to 2 hours due to the lack of power supply. Now, the argument was, well, yeah, in this weather, we've got this greater power consumption. Actually, no. It was the failure of the supply, because wind energy is an if, maybe, might work at certain times. Obviously, wind energy doesn't work if the wind's not blowing or blowing sufficiently.
Right.
So that doesn't work. That happens all the time. And then, so you still, to have this power supply you need, you still have to build the clean coal or the natural gas plants. You got to have them. Well, everybody was so confident in wind energy, despite the science that said no. It was so politically acceptable that they became an over-reliance on wind energy. It's really not a good idea. It's certainly not economic. And the windmills have killed, according to many environmentalists in California, where you live, there have been environmental groups suing environmental groups who were promoting wind turbines because the turbines kill all kinds of migratory birds.
Right.
In oil and gas, from a regulatory standpoint, we had to go and install these nets over oil and gas tanks that had open tops, but they were water tanks actually, but they were saltwater tanks. But every now and then, I mean, it was pretty rare, but every now and then there might be a bird in there that, landed on the tank or whatever.
Right.
Okay, so we had put these nets on there. Yet anyone working at wind generators will tell you that they pick up dead birds all the time. They kill birds all the time. And so it's just amazing how suddenly it's acceptable to kill birds, migratory birds included, and endangered species birds with windmills. Environmental. So I mean, again, it's not environmental. It's not environmental, and it's not clean energy. The footprint that a windmill requires is much greater than an oil and gas well. Yet the oil and gas well is infinitely more reliable and produces vastly more. One good oil and gas well will produce as much electricity as a whole stream of those windmills, just one well.
Yeah.
Now that's a vast difference in the environmental footprint. And but yeah, we've had shutdowns, lack of energy, and it's not due to demand. Demand's obviously higher. It's obviously very high for the winter, but it is nowhere near even what a record hot summer would be. It's a lack of supply that has caused this. And the demand, which everyone could have expected it to be there, to be met, there was just this idea that the wind could meet it, yet it couldn't.
And it's far more dangerous for you to lose power in the winter, like you have the last couple of days, than say for us in California, because you just with an hour or two, you can bust your pipes at your house and your pool, and you know, I'm sure hospitals have their problems and all that, but it's far more dangerous.
Oh, well, even the city of Oklahoma City had to shut down water supply in certain areas because at one water processing plant, the pipelines froze. Not the pipelines carrying moving water, but the pipeline that were carrying the chemicals, throughout the plant to put in the water to keep the water safe. And they froze, so they had to slow them down. I mean, we've, had minus 13 here, I believe was our low in Oklahoma City. Very unusual, set new cold records. And yet the natural gas generation of electricity, the clean coal generation of electricity went right on unabated. That's what kept everything alive.
Right.
If we had very much more wind energy here in Oklahoma, we would have really been in trouble, like the millions of people in Texas and the hundreds of thousands in other states are.
Yeah.
And we were lucky that we just had these rolling blackouts for about an hour. They've been suspended, by the way, and here in Oklahoma, but other places have not been so fortunate.
So another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, we have a Senator Wiener in California who probably at the encouragement of Governor Newsom has introduced a bill to ban fracking. And I know fracking seems to be highly unpopular with environmentalists, and they think that it causes earthquakes and all kinds of things. And you know quite a bit about fracking, so I wanted to ask you about fracking. So is it the dangerous, horrible thing that we hear that it is?
It is not. Fracking has been done. It depends on who you talk to is when the first frac was done. My research on this was back to 1945 with Halliburton and Duncan, Oklahoma, is where the first hydraulic fracking was done. But we need to make sure we understand the word fracking. Fracking of oil and gas zones has been done since the Civil War. It's how you frack today that's being done. So in the 40s, in 1947, there was in Kansas was a well that was, some people think was the first commercially fracked well. And some people argue that it was in 1949, about 12 miles away from Duncan, Oklahoma, that the first hydraulic frack was successfully done, but it's in the 40s. And today, 3 million or more wells have been fracked worldwide. 3 million.
Wow.
Now, in not one case is underground water issues ever occurred or anything unsafe has occurred with fracking in over 3 million of them, unless there was something done wrong. There would just be a small handful, just a tiny handful of that. Now, let's think about this a little bit. He wants to ban fracking. Well, he don't want to ban fracking because he thinks it's unsafe. He don't want to ban fracking. He might say that, but he knows it's untrue. 3 million of them, and they're totally, I mean, how do you have something that's done 3 million times and you don't have any adverse effects and say it's unsafe. I mean, that's what you call delusional.
So one of the things people say is that it causes earthquakes.
Fracking is not caused an earthquake anywhere.
Okay.
Fracking can't cause an earthquake. Fracking occurs for a very short period of time. It only lasts for a short period of time. It doesn't cause earthquakes.
A short period of time.
Some fracks are a few hours. Some might be,
Oh.
but if they're staged fracks, that is, if it's a horizontal well drilled horizontally, and then let's say the well is 4,000 feet horizontal, and you frack, say, every 500 feet or every 1,000 feet in that well bore, and then you move up to the next 1,000 feet and frack that. So, but again, the fracking portion only lasts for a short period of time. It doesn't go on for days. You know, you have to pressure up. And so you get to a pressure significant to crack or fracture the rock. Fracture the rock is called hydraulic fracturing, and everyone uses the term fracking. But it's hydraulic fracturing is the technical term. Now, I want you to think of it like this. Every day in your city, there are people driving trucks full of a highly volatile, explosive, and dangerous liquid. They drive them by schools. Mm-hmm. They drive them by stores, by Walmarts, for example, in their parking lot. They drive them into convenience stations. And obviously, I'm talking about gasoline trucks.
Right.
If a gasoline truck is not properly handled, it could be just a big explosive bomb, certainly a major fiery event. Now, you and I, we see a gasoline truck at a gas station to go in to get an icy or a drink or whatever. We don't think anything about it. Why is that? It's because the people who handle this highly volatile, explosive liquid know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. You handle it safely every day. They handle it constantly, and they're successful in every way in doing it. When's the last time we heard of a gasoline truck exploding and killing anybody? It's very, very rare. So just in the same facet, hydraulic fracking is 99.5% water and sand. That's what's in the frac fluid. 99.5% water and sand.
Explain what fracking is. Is it displacing oil with water and sand and bringing oil up to where you can pull it out? Is that what fracking is?
Good question. Fracking, hydraulic fracturing, is where you take and you pump a hydraulic or water and sand, but we'll just call it a frac fluid at this point, and you frack it through into a formation of rock that is believed or has already demonstrated to contain hydrocarbons.
Okay.
That oil and or gas. These rocks have porosity and permeability. Mm-hmm. You know what porosity and permeability are when you think about a sponge or about pumice rock.
Sure.
A sponge and pumice rock have both porosity, that is, they have spaces in them. If you look up a pumice rock or a sponge, it's spaces. It has permeability. That means the spaces are connected, and so something in one space can move with pressure to another space. So when you drill an oil and gas well through a oil and gas hydrocarbon bearing formation, if it has porosity and permeability, then when you make that hole in that rock, you've created a low pressure. And pressure moves from high to low. So whatever is in those pores of the rock and can travel through the connected pores will go to that wellbore. And depending upon the amount of pressure in that rock formation, it'll either push its way all the way to the surface or you lift it by pumping it all the way to the surface. And as you remove the hydrocarbons, the fluids, the gases out of that hole, it brings again a low pressure. And so it keeps feeding in until finally there's no more pressure in the rock. Now, what happens is that we find that there are rocks with oil and gas hydrocarbon in them. They have porosity. The porosity is filled or partially filled with the oil and or gas, and nearly always salt water. But there's not very much permeability. So then we hydraulically frack that. Well, there's pores right there by the wellbore. So as those high pressured frac fluid hits those pores, it builds up and it takes a certain amount of pressure to crack into the next pore. And then it just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going on out, depending on the amount of pressure you have. Now you've connected a lot of the pores, and the oil and gas hydrocarbon now can move to the wellbore under the pressure going back, and you lift it out or it flows out. So that's one thing. Now, shale is a little bit different. Shale doesn't have a lot of perm and it doesn't have a lot of porosity, but the oil and gas hydrocarbon is still there. And so with shale, you go in and you frack the rock in it. Shale, of course, is a different kind of rock, and there's ways to make it frack and kind of fracture highly. You get lots of fractures in there, so the oil and gas can go through those tiny fractures after they've been hydraulically fracked to the wellbore to get out. And America has an amazing amount of hydrocarbons in shale rock. We've all heard of shale gas.
Mm-hmm.
We have like a 200-year or more supply of natural gas.
Wow.
Clean, wonderful, inexpensive natural gas. And we have abundant ways to get it out economically. We could have some of the cheapest and cleanest electricity in the world if we just simply use natural gas for generation electricity. That's not to leave coal out. Coal is also an amazing element and wonderful for generating electricity. And today we have the clean coal technologies and the abilities to find the cleanest coal. And America has, I don't know, I've seen figures up to 1,000-year supply. It varies on the consumption of coal because it's going down. So the number of how many, years,
Sure.
decades, whatever number you want to use keeps going up. But we have a massive amount of coal also. So we independent. That's what we in America know. That's what Donald Trump knew, except Donald Trump was different. He's the only guy that came into office and actually caused it to happen. So that's, he helped America, our national security, our economy. Who benefits from $2 gasoline the most? The poorest of America.
Right.
They benefit the most. Their home heating bills are the lower. Keeping oil and gas low and abundant, if you care about the poorest among us, that is essential. It's not possible to do so if we don't do that.
Now, what do you say to people that say that we have more earthquakes now that we've been fracking?
Oh, there's so much nonsense behind all of that. First of all, Oklahoma has something like, just using Oklahoma here, something like 100,000 known faults in it. We have a major tectonic fault going through Oklahoma called the Nemaha Ridge. But there are lots of massive faults throughout the United States. It's estimated by some, various people use various numbers, but there's probably another 100,000 faults in Oklahoma that are not yet discovered. But the United States Geological Service used to have this on its website. Wherever there is a fault, there has been an earthquake. Mm-hmm. And wherever there's an earthquake, there will be a fault. When an earthquake happens, you've got the rock and it gets pressurized and then it breaks and the rock starts moving. It cracks, you get your fault and then it moves. Earthquakes generally will move a fault, depending on the magnitude, a 1/16 of an inch, barely moves it, but that's massive power. That causes an earthquake. So we've got faults in Oklahoma with 2,000 feet of throw. In other words, the rocks have moved 2,000 feet apart, half a mile. Okay.
Wow.
So you can imagine the quantity of earthquakes. In the 1950s in Oklahoma, we had a 5.0 earthquake in what was called an earthquake swarm. There was no fracking in the county, Canadian county, where that occurred. There were no disposal wells where that occurred in Canadian county. It was a natural occurrence. Now, recently in Oklahoma, there's maybe 4 wells, is estimated, were possibly contributing to the earthquakes, but a lot of stuff were naturally occurring. Here in Oklahoma County, the most populous county in Oklahoma, we have a lake called Lake Arcadia. There were 6 4.0 earthquakes in Lake Arcadia between the years of 2012 and 2016. However, when we looked at the data there and with the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, which regulates oil and gas industry, started looking at the data, the one thing they saw was, first of all, there were no nearby disposal wells. There was no nearby fracking. The closest well had disposed of a very small amount of water and not under pressure. It was under a vacuum. So you can't move, if you're putting water down and it goes under a vacuum, you're not pushing water against a fault, lubricating a fault. And so this doesn't make sense that disposal operations affect that. So what they started looking at, since the Lake Arcadia, all the locations of these 6 earthquakes were at the north end and the south end of the lake. Well, guess what was at the north end and the south end of the lake? 2 well-established faults. And so they started looking at the lake levels, and the lake levels would fluctuate real high, and then you'd get a fault, a earthquake. And then it would get down real low, and you'd get an earthquake. So it was the variation in what's called hydraulic load, the weight of the surface water. Now, you understand this. Everyone listening to this can understand this. Remember the earthquake in Washington, D.C., or actually it was in Connecticut, that cracked the Washington Monument, and it had to be closed and had to be rebuilt? What happened there was a massive rainstorm. And in the East Coast, the water supply is, there's more people. So the underground water is monitored more closely. So they were monitoring the water wells. You had this massive rainstorm, and they had this one zone that was a major part of the water supply that covered counties. And it was 15 feet thick. Pardon me, the zone was very thick, but it had a 33% porosity. And what they noticed with this rain, that you had a 15-foot fill up, and then boom, was this earthquake in an area previously not having earthquakes. You had 5 feet of water go into this zone in a few days over counties. Well, you can run numbers on that, but that is billions upon billions, maybe even trillions of tons of water. And so it put what's called a hammer effect on the fractured zone, where there was an old fault and it fractured it. That's what caused the earthquake. Well, that was back then. Do you know, in 2020 in North Carolina, hurricane went through in August. They had massive 14 inches of rain. A few days later, another 5.0 earthquake in an area not known. In September of 2020, the Chinese put out a study about what they called the coupling of rainfall and earthquakes. So what we see here in Oklahoma are lots of different factors that contributed to earthquakes. The Cushing oil refinery, which, by the way, the Keystone Pipeline is built to, and in which the XL portion, this part 4, was to come in effect. There was been some really big earthquakes there also. Interesting enough, if you track how, because there's massive overground storage, millions and millions of barrels and hundreds of millions of tons of oil and gas stored there. And as the oil storage got real low, bang, an earthquake. It gets filled back up, bang, another earthquake. It's called the hammer effect of the surface load. You hammer it, and then you take it off. Hammer it, take it off. Billions or millions of tons, and it weakens the formation, and finally it cracks, and you get the earthquake.
I would imagine that happens in California as well, when we've got Northern California and all the snow that we get.
Yeah, the snow melt. It's really, there's all kinds of studies done in California about this, the Napa Valley earthquakes, for example, and the snow melt that comes down. You get all this water comes down, gets absorbed, then you have your dry season, the water's all used up. You're talking billions of tons of water change, pressure and weight, and you get that. So that effect, that's what's called the hydraulic load effect, or the hammer effect on the surface. And there are other things in California that apply, but my gosh, the quantity of studies on that in California, I mean, these earthquakes are happening nowhere near any oil and gas, fracking, disposal wells, or anything else. And
we also have much better monitoring of earthquakes now than we've ever had before.
In fact, if I remember, there was in the 1950s when Oklahoma had the earthquake swarm with the 5.0 earthquake, and had, we had hundreds of earthquakes. No one really knows how many. There was one seismograph, I believe it was, in St. Louis. That was the only one there was. Now we have seismographs in some areas, like every 25 miles in Oklahoma. We have hundreds of them. Right. And so every little tremor, which is now called an earthquake. I mean, USGS and most every school that has earthquake studies, like the Michigan Technical Institute and others, 2.7 or less is a tremor. Greater than 2.7 is an earthquake, and which they would call. It generally 3.0 to 4.0 was not considered even a serious earthquake, unlikely to cause any damage, more likely to move pictures and stuff like that. 4.0 could do damage. Well, now you've got people calling earthquakes at 1.0. You can't even feel that. Only an instrument can record it, but you can't feel it. You can't even feel 2.0 earthquakes unless they're really, really shallow. And but people will call everything an earthquake today. And so that's part of the numbers game that's being done to jack up the numbers of earthquakes. But we've seen, as was predicted back in 2012, 2013, 2014, when all this stuff started in Oklahoma, the scientists here are saying, look, this is a natural phenomenon sweeping up from the Pacific Rim, went through Mexico, it's made its way into Oklahoma and Texas, and so on, and it'll move its way into Kansas. And as it radiates farther north, the pressure spreads out, the earthquakes get less, they get less frequent. That's exactly what we've seen. And that was predicted like 6-7 years ago. And so did some disposal wells cause some issues? Yes, it would have been a small number at most, a very small number. But disposal cause it, fracturing does not cause earthquakes. Anyone that says differently shouldn't be regarded seriously. And certainly not the earthquakes people should be concerned about. And disposal wells possibly could, some of them have, if they're high volume injecting under high pressure. But the economics of injecting salt water, where did the salt water come from? It came from the ground. It came from those rocks, and you're putting it back in those rocks.
Well, the other thing is, isn't there chemicals in that fracking liquid that you inject into the earth?
Yes, there are. And the 99.5% of the frac flood, again, is water and sand. Now, obviously, you would think no one would say that water and or sand being injected, say, at 9,000 feet below the surface of the earth into a sandstone or limestone or a shale, whatever it is, a dolomite, we consider that environmentally unfriendly. Okay, but there are lots of other chemicals put in, but very small amounts. It's in the other 0.5% of the hydraulic frac fluid, 0.5%. Let's keep that perspective in mind. But some of the chemicals, for example, gel guard gum is used as a suspension agent in frac fluid. You have gel guard gum and you eat it. It's in your toothpaste, it's in cosmetics, it's in ice cream, it's in cake batter and bread and condiments. Kraft salad dressing is a good example of gel guard gum. Ammonium persulfate. It's used as a stabilizer in there. It's in plastics, in disinfectant. You put it on your hair for hair coloring, etc. I don't, but it's in Clairol products. It's in Glidden paint, house paint, citric acid. Citric acid, we all know what that is. It's in fruit. It's in oranges, lemons, lemon juice, in many other foods and beverages. I use it in my swimming pool occasionally, but it's in all kinds of products, like Tide and Shout and Lysol and cleaning solutions and lemonade. Of course, you can buy citric acid down at, your local pool supply store that carries products.
Is that the only chemical that's in the fracking?
No, there's lots of others here. Borate salts, for example, that's in laundry detergents, hand soap. It's water conditioners use it. Fish protectors use it. You put it in fish tanks with some of the chemicals to stabilize the water for your fish tanks. Okay, dimethyl formaldehyde. What that product does is to prevent corrosion of the pipe as you run the water and the sand down it. It's used to make pharmaceuticals. It's injected in your body in certain drugs. It makes acrylic fibers. It's in plastics that are in your home that you handle every day. Isopropanol, it's to increase the viscosity of the frac fluid. In other words, how easily it flows through the pipe. It's in glass cleaners. You put it on under your arms as antiperspirants. It's also in hair coloring. The liquid bandage called New Skin liquid bandage? It's in that. All right. Avon has it. Amway has it in their stuff. Revlon, L'Oreal, CoverGirl, hand sanitizer has it. Right Guard spray has it in there. That's part of these dangerous chemicals in frac fluid. Hydrochloric acid. Now, hydrochloric acid and muriatic acid, those are used to dissolve the minerals and start the fissures in the rock. They help that. But those are used in swimming pools. They're used in bathrooms. I put muriatic acid in my swimming pool all the time. We find those in all kinds of products. Febreze, for example, is one people know about it. Gaines is another one. You got petroleum distillate. It helps lubricate things. And in your home, you've got that in cosmetics and hair products. Max Factor, CoverGirl. Do you ever use Dissolve It? Ever heard of Dissolve It? That's a carpet cleaner type thing. That's in that. Potassium chloride, and that's a table salt substitute.
Yeah.
Potassium chloride, you use it in place of salt, and that's when the frac fluid, you eat it. It's in medicines.
So there's no chemicals. There's no chemicals that are injected in it in any amount that would hurt the environment or hurt anything.
Well, anything will hurt. Water will hurt the environment.
Well, that's true.
Floods hurt the environment. It's how you measure what hurts the environment. A flood is water. It hurts the environment, right? So anything hurts the environment if you do it enough. Where has there been a frac that has damaged the environment in any way? I mean, we would be hearing that ad infinitum. The lawsuits would be crazy.
Then why are people against? Then why are people against fracking?
For the very same reason they're against the XL pipeline.
Okay.
They don't want cheap energy because you can't control people and affect their lives if they have cheap energy. You can't force them to be green in their religion, which is what they're trying to get you to do in their environmental religion. And they want to get everybody forced into public transportation, everybody but them. They have no intention of living like that, but they're going to expect us to. And they don't want cheap energy because cheap energy means you don't need government as much. And that's what they're after. Their claims about the environment. I mean, look at AOC, look what she said. They didn't have enough wind generators in Texas. Are you kidding me? How disjointed from reality are you to say something like that? How disconnected from reality must you be? The problem in Texas was the wind generators. Everyone down there admits it. They're going to have hearings on it. They're going to try to figure out how do we get out of this mess that we got in from wind. And so it's a real interesting thing. Yet these people want to force this stuff on us even more. And but our freedom, your and my ability to move inexpensively, to be able to afford airplane tickets at our choice instead of somebody else's choice, to be able to go where we want, when we want, how we want, it all depends on the cost of energy. Now, it won't for them, because most of their travel is paid for by you and I. It's taxpayer funded travel. They won't live like that, but they're going to expect you and I to do it. So that's why if we don't have cheap energy, we're going to suffer tremendously, and our country becomes exposed to people like Vladimir Putin and Chairman Z. So it's the two happiest people on planet Earth about the Keystone Pipeline decision of Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin and Chairman Z. I mean, it's just how do we get around that? These people have no criticism for what he's doing. Now, how do you defend that? Even if you're an environmentalist, how do you get the two biggest polluters on Earth? Well, India is actually the second, but China, India, Russia. And you've got these two major polluters, and in particular, that it seems like we're doing everything we can to appease them in every way we can, and to hurt Americans. Just the callous indifference and brutality that Joe Biden dealt with all those, including union members, supposedly his constituency, but all those people that were working on that line, and all the businesses that went with them and their employees, all the things that spread out, and for the future of the cost of energy in this country, it's inexplicable what he's done if you're thinking about what's best for America and Americans.
Yeah.
The Keystone Pipeline is just the beginning of what's going to happen, in my opinion.
Well, also, haven't there been some governors that are enacting legislation to try and protect themselves from federal executive orders that they deem unconstitutional or that hurt their states? I mean, in addition to Texas trying to secede, what are they calling it, Texit, after Brexit? But there's also other states that are just trying to enact legislation to protect themselves. Do you know anything about that?
I've been following it a little bit. It's really kind of in its infancy at this point. And, I just hope it's not too little too late. It's just going to be real challenge. There's also lots of retaliation that can be done, by the Biden and people. Now, again, there's no doubt Joe Biden is certainly the guy signing the pieces of paper. Who's ever pushing all this? Well, I think it's the stuff he's deeply believed in all along. He's just tried to pretend he didn't. But certainly he's surrounded himself with the most extreme radicals, people whose connection with the reality is questionable. And he surrounded himself with them, and he's knowingly done it. This isn't done unknowingly. He knows these people. He knows who they are. He knows what they believe and stand for. He's got to believe in all this stuff himself. And so governors can see what's coming. They can see what's coming in their state. The idea is states will become simply executors of Washington's, the swamp's policies, and governors are going to be expected to go along with it. And the governor's saying, no, we're not going to do that to my state. But how effective that's going to be is that remains to be seen. It's nice that they're doing it, but is that the best avenue? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, do you have any parting thoughts that answers to questions I haven't asked you?
I would just say is people cannot imagine their lives without petroleum if they tried. You can't run a hospital without petroleum. You can't run a hospital without oil and gas wells. Let me put it that way. in oil and gas refineries, in oil and gas pipelines. Imagine trying to have a hospital. I mean, forget about the lights and the electricity and the heat and the cooling. A lot of the equipment that's used in the hospital comes from petroleum. Everything that's plastic comes from petroleum, oil and gas. Think of the sanitary things that go on in hospitals now. The needles that are used, the syringes, those are made from petroleum. But not only that, the medicines in hospitals, many of those medicines are made from petroleum or use petroleum derivatives to carry in the actual medicines. The tubing and stuff for like an IV from petroleum. It just goes on and on and on. Now, that would be a hospital, but think about operating a school. How do you get school buses run? How do you have the school function without petroleum? Most of the products in the school are made from petroleum, including if you're using wooden desks and chairs instead of plastic, which are from petroleum. You've got metal parts, those come from petroleum. That is, the petroleum was used to manufacture them. How would you run a fire department? Can you imagine an electric truck carrying tons of water to a fire and it's powered by electricity? My gosh, how is it going to go very far at all? It's not. You need the power that comes from petroleum. And that only works through the internal combustion engine. Nothing in the planet has ever found to be superior to the internal combustion engine as far as the size and weight, the mass, and the energy to put in such a small place to move so much weight with so much velocity or speed. You couldn't run a police force without it. You couldn't. How could you run sewer systems? You've got to have pumps. How do you generate that electricity? Well, you can see right now, if you were depending on windmills right now, your sewers would all be backed up. It's oil and gas, natural gas. It is generating electricity, coal, which is hydrocarbon, generating that electricity, or nuclear, where there's a few nuclear plants left, generating it. In a few places, there's some dams. Other than that, it's all natural gas and coal. So you couldn't even run the sewer systems. You couldn't run the water systems in a city. How would you run the trash system? I mean, you couldn't have a city. How do you lay asphalt? How do you build houses without oil and gas? It's, again, people do not understand, and that's by design, I think, but people do not understand the role that oil and gas plays in our lives. The way you can't make any more environmentally friendly, environmentally advantageous energy than hydrocarbons. Notice I haven't said fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is kind of like talking about vestigial organs. The old theory of macroevolution and all that nonsense that people now know is garbage. The vestigial organs they know is not, there's not any. And just the sheer volumetrics of hydrocarbons tell you that you couldn't have had that from organic matter. And so calling them fossil fuels is not really a term. They're hydrocarbons is a better, more scientifically accurate term.
More accurate.
Yeah, it's more accurate. Now, the hydrocarbons, we find fossils in them, but the fossils didn't produce the hydrocarbons. And I mean, you just think about, what's used to be when I was in school back in the 70s, when they would estimate that one large dinosaur could produce 3 barrels of oil today. Well, that's totally insane nonsense, I mean, scientifically. But if it were true, we consume worldwide about 92, 93 million barrels of oil a day.
Wow.
You have 3 dinosaurs for each one of those barrels.
Wow. Yeah.
So right there, 270 million dinosaurs every single day.
Yeah.
You look at the quantity of oil that we've consumed since the 1860s when we first started using oil, when Drake up in Pennsylvania. You look at the quantum of oil that's been consumed, and then you try to back calculate organic mass to get there.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond possible. And in that would require a 100% efficient decomposition and capture of all that organic mass. And that, of course, as you know, an animal dies right now, lays on top of the ground. It's gone in a period of time, depending upon environmental factors. It doesn't turn to oil.
Right,
It turns to
right,
dust. And it
right.
seems like I've heard that, well, from dust to dust. But anyhow, so fossil fuels is kind of a comical term that people use. It's just everybody used to it. Mhm.
Yeah.
But anyhow, so I know we covered a lot of subjects and we blitzed through them.
No,
But
that's really good. That's fascinating. I'm hoping that somehow the Keystone Pipeline thing gets turned around, but we'll see.
yeah, it's just one of many, many things that will be done. The regulation side of it, again,
Yeah.
people do not understand. We out here in the real world, living under the masses of regulation, nonsense regulation, and then Trump came in and started getting rid of all that, getting rid of some of it. You can get rid of all of it, and make things a lot more realistic and a lot more, where the regulations started to make some sense.
Yeah.
It's going to go back to the other way. I mean, it's just in the oil and gas industry, we used to get these nonsense surveys in from the Environmental Protection Agency wanting all this ridiculous data that was designed to make it hard on you to be in the oil and gas industry. It had nothing to do with the environment. They just pretended that it did.
Yeah.
And it's every year. I can tell you one on like natural gas pipelines. It's like some pipelines in America fall under federal regulation, Department of Transportation regulation. Some pipelines then fall under state regulation, and then some fall under local regulation in a few places, and then some are what are called unregulated pipeline. Now, just because that word unregulated there, don't think that there's not all kinds of standards on that.
Right.
What it means, it's not federal or state compliant. You still have standards you have to go by. You have insurance and you're complying with all those standards, which are the same state and federal standards.
Right.
But you just don't have to fill out these nonsense forms on lines that are, there's no purpose in doing that other than to satisfy a governmental person. But there's in Oklahoma alone, the last numbers I saw, and this has been a few years, there was enough pipeline in Oklahoma to circle the earth 24 times.
Oh my gosh.
And that's just Oklahoma. Now, Texas would be many times that.
That's amazing.
In other states. If you've ever get online and you look at a pipeline map online, those will just be the big pipelines. You'll see that America just looks like it's totally crisscrossed with pipelines for all kinds of things. Pipelines are wonderfully successful, okay? What happened here under Obama, they decided that we needed to have a pipeline awareness program. Every day, you drive somewhere, you go to the store, there's pipelines under every street, all kinds of them, various kinds, water lines, natural gas lines.
What would be the reason for a pipeline awareness program?
To make it hard on having a pipeline. But let me explain. First, they wanted you to come up with a brochure, and they wanted you to have a notice awareness program of everyone that lived within 300 feet of that pipeline, that you would send them a notice of your pipeline, just telling them you had a pipeline. So, it's nonsense. That's just so totally stupid. We've been living with pipelines for what, 150 years? Well, more than that. And so anyhow, this would be people in apartment houses, renters, and you're supposed to find out who they are. Well, a rental company's not going to give you their names.
Right.
Can't do that. Landlord is not going to give you the rental person's name. So then after about a year of putting out this little notice thing, and you're having to grab addresses,
Yeah.
and guess what? With this regulation came all these businesses who would do it for you. Wonder who owned those businesses. So then the next year it came up, they wanted you to actually do a survey of these people to find out if they remembered getting it and did they understand it.
Oh my gosh.
That's what you had to do. And you had to fill out the forms and show how you'd gone through and how you'd attempted to contact these people, by mail.
Right.
Then they come up with the idea that you had to do door knocking and you had to go discuss the pipeline.
Unbelievable.
I mean, it's insane.
So was it just regulation meant to burden the
Exactly.
companies so badly that it would just put them out of business?
It would, that way you would stop using the pipeline. Now, these people are saying, well, we're just trying to protect people. And it's like,
Right.
okay,
But it's
how did you do that before you had this regulation?
right.
You already were protecting the people. This couldn't be to
Right.
protect people. This
Right.
has to do with creating an intense burden. So this is the kind of thing we face in the oil and gas industry. Donald Trump turned it around some. He did what we wanted him to do. That's why he was supported. He didn't just say that he was going to do it. He actually did it.
Right.
That's why he had the support. He actually did the things that we wanted done. We've been wanting done. And he finally stepped up and said, I will get it done. And so that's what happened there. We see this all coming back with a vengeance. And you think AOC doesn't think that, people like her, Schumer, Pelosi, the picks that he's got for the Environmental Protection Agency and all kinds of things. The Department of Transportation, he puts a guy that has no clue as head of the Department of Transportation. A guy that's he himself is demonstrably disconnected with reality, in my opinion.
Is that Buttigieg?
Yes. What in the world would that guy possibly know about transportation? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a joke. And but in my opinion, but in any event, that's what we're facing, and everybody in America is going to be living with this, and we're going to be seeing more and more problems in the future. But
Yeah.
we got to figure out a way to overcome it. The American people are always smart. They're very ingenious, and
Mhm.
got freedom currently to do so.
Yeah.
Kind of have the free speech. Some of that's been taken away, but
Right.
we'll get it back. We're
We'll
going to
figure out. Yeah, we'll figure out a way to work around it or get it back.
we'll get a way to get it back, and we'll defend ourselves. So
Yeah.
defend our country.
Well, thank you, Jack. I appreciate you taking
Sure.
the time to talk to us. These are important and kind of complicated issues in some ways. So it's good to have more understanding.
Well, I tried to make it understandable, but now you can see why Rush Limbaugh was so good.
Yeah. It's sad that he died today.
It's what a terrible loss to America. This is like Reagan dying. It's and this is a terrible loss to the world.
Yeah.
I mean, to freedom in the world is Russia's listened to all over the world, and stood for freedom and educating people, and was just an incredible man, and incredible life. So, but we have to go on. We've got to press on, and we've got to find new leaders, and they're out there.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Need those voices.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks much. I enjoyed being here.